Okay, chapter 29 is about farming. Competition in agriculture, as you recall, you have no market power, there are lots of them, and they have an identical product. So what kind of market are they dealing with? Pure competition. It's a purely competitive market. Now, what makes farming a little bit unique, though, compared to any of the other purely competitive markets, is its importance. If you think about it, we have to be able to produce food. It is actually considered a national security industry, meaning that it has to be protected at all costs. So in the agricultural markets, you'll see things that you don't see other places. Now, some of the reason that they behave the way they do is that they have a very inelastic demand. It's very stable over time. This demand curve really doesn't change much. To lower prices doesn't help them a lot. People are still going to eat what they eat. People don't eat a lot more just because it's it's lesser cost. So reducing your prices doesn't do a lot of good here. At the same time, they have a supply curve that's all over the place. When you look at farming, there are really two things that determine the supply. Number one is the weather, which is unpredictable year to year. Number two is a problem with response lags. We've talked about all along the fact that in industry, you can adjust your production. Well, that's not really true when it comes to agriculture. Typically, you're looking at spring when you do your planting, and fall when you're doing your harvesting. That's a 6 to 9 month production cycle. So you are planting under one set of conditions and harvesting under a completely new set. An example might be if last year corn sold for a very high amount. What's likely to happen is that people will plant a lot of corn the next year, thinking that they'll get that same amount. But when they produce a lot more, come harvest time, a lot of corn comes in, what happens to the price? It bellies out. So what you see is the supply curve jumping all over the place due to weather and these response lags. So farming is a very difficult industry to make it in. And by no means is it a human labor type of industry. It is very capital intensive. If you look at our agricultural market, 60% increase in production and 2/3 less labor. We've done that with machinery. And all this has come about, in the span of 100 years. So this makes it really difficult industry to deal with. Twice farming has almost failed in this country. First, we're going to talk about the first farm depression. Back in the 1920s, the first farm depression took place. If you look at that time, what was happening was there was a war in Europe. World War I was going on. So at that time, they weren't producing any food. So our farmers had a bunch of new sales. So the demand curve was way out here. Okay? At the end of the war, what always happens is people go back to growing their own food. We had gotten used to feeding the world, and suddenly our demand curve came back. And that was in response to the fact that we no longer ship food out to Europe. They were able to grow their own. Now, another thing that happens in war times is when the war ends, you see technological advances, which is a factor of supply. That shifts the supply curve out. So what you saw was prices go from here down to there and bankrupted many, many farmers. Due to that, the government decided that they were going to try to protect farming. It came up with many U.S. farm policies. And we're going to talk about that in this next segment.